And joining me for an exclusive interview is Michael Carpenter, former security advisor to ex-U.S. President Joe Biden and senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Mr. Carpenter, as we go to air, we're hearing that Ukraine has agreed to cap its army at 800,000 troops, that President Zelensky is saying Kyiv is ready to largely move forward with America's plans. Of course, land concessions and security guarantees are still up in the air. But in your mind, are these talks the last chance for Kyiv to win over Washington?
No, I don't think so. I don't think this is the last chance, and I don't think these talks are actually going to lead anywhere in the next few weeks. And for the simple fact that I don't see that there is a proposal that will simultaneously meet with the approval of Moscow and Kyiv. And I think this has been the case for a long time. And until the situation on the battlefield or until Russia's economic situation changes significantly for the worse, I don't think we see a prospect for peace coming anytime soon. So what likely will happen is the Europeans will help the United States to craft a proposal that meets with Ukraine's desires. Ukraine will make some concessions, but at the end of the day, that won't be acceptable to Putin. Similarly, the 28 points that came from Russia that were endorsed by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff were unacceptable for Ukraine and for most of America's European allies. So we're kind of stuck in a stalemate without either side being able to accept a proposal that would meet the desires of the other side.
When it comes to Ukraine, and we'll get to the agreeability perhaps of both sides in just a moment, but specifically on Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky last week telling us that his country faces, quote, one of the most difficult moments of its history. He's under a lot of pressure, President Zelensky, right now at home. Do you expect him to want to strike somewhat of a deal sooner rather than later? I mean, does he view this potentially as the best or close to the best he's going to get?
No, I don't think so, for the reasons I just outlined. But what I think President Zelensky fears most is having another blow up with the United States of the sort that happened in February in that disastrous Oval Office meeting that everybody remembers. And remember that President Zelensky and Ukraine very much need U.S. intelligence sharing in order to be able to prosecute the war. And they rely to a great degree on the continuation of what's called the prioritized Ukraine requirements list, which is essentially a NATO terminology for U.S. sales of weapons to European countries that then pass them on to Ukraine. Without the intelligence and without the high-end capabilities coming from the United States, the battlefield tilts in Russia's favor. And so Zelensky very much wants to keep up the pretense of a negotiation. He wants to seem constructive. And frankly, I think he can do that and he can make some concessions. But again, that doesn't mean that this is going anywhere. And last thing I'll say, I think Zelensky understands very well that a unilateral security guarantee from the United States is not to be trusted. And so without something that really is either NATO's Article 5 or something very similar to it, I don't think he'll sign up to an agreement.
President Zelensky is pushing to meet with Donald Trump again in Washington as soon as possible. You mentioned there, obviously, the blow-up back in February. I mean, how thin of a tightrope will he be walking in between insisting on Ukrainian sovereignty but also keeping Donald Trump on side?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty thin tightrope, and that's going to be a difficult balancing act because there are competing camps in the United States in the Trump administration. And so my personal sense from what I've seen and read and from President Trump's endorsement of the 28-point plan is that the president himself favors a solution that is heavily tilted in Russia's favor. And it appears that the vice president is also on the same page. Others, like Secretary of State Marco Rubio and perhaps Treasury Secretary Steve Bessent, seem to favor a strategy that imposes further costs on Russia and gives Ukraine a little bit more runway to be able to negotiate something that is more advantageous to Kyiv. But it's going to be a very difficult balancing act. The main thing I think Zelensky needs to do is appear constructive and thankful towards the United States, grateful for all the assistance he's received, and hopefully keep the disputes to the closed doors session.
Do you think the pressure President Zelensky is under at home, including the bribery scandal in his country's energy sector, will be playing into this discussion? Will Donald Trump smell weakness in a way?
Oh, I think that's a near certainty. Certainly, Zelensky feels under pressure. His legitimacy is weaker now than it was just a few weeks ago. This is a very serious corruption scandal that implicates figures very close to Zelensky himself. And the United States knows that. And so they know that President Zelensky feels the pressure. And so he's going to, he's going to be perhaps even called out on this corruption scandal in public when he's in Washington. He's going to have a very good response for what he is doing, not just to contain this one scandal, but to make sure that others similar to it don't arise in the future.
Do you think, and I want to come back to what you mentioned right at the beginning of our discussion, do you think that we are at risk here of putting the cart before the horse, that in the end both sides won't agree and we'll be back at square one, and all this talk of pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky, pressure on Europe to make a deal right now will be, again, a week, 2 weeks, then months behind us?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is where we will ultimately be at year's end. I don't think this diplomacy is going to produce a breakthrough for the simple reason that Vladimir Putin is not going to want any kind of credible security guarantee that stops the fighting sufficiently to allow Ukraine to proceed with European integration and to create an independent, sovereign, democratic state integrated into the European Union. That is a strategic defeat for Vladimir Putin, and he won't allow for any agreement that gives Ukraine that opportunity. And by the same token, Ukraine is not going to agree to any sort of agreement that would lack those credible security guarantees that will allow for its development as an EU aspirant. And so between President Putin's views on the one hand and President Zelensky's on the other, I don't really see how a balance can be struck until, as I said earlier, until one of the two sides faces a deteriorating situation, either economically or on the battlefield.
Is President Zelensky facing enough of a deteriorating situation that might be enough to tip Ukraine into accepting something that perhaps they might not have before?
No, and let's be concrete about this. So what President Putin is demanding from Ukraine is all of the Donbass, all of the oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk, including the fortress or citadel cities, as they're sometimes called, of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are pretty heavily populated cities in western Donetsk. Giving up these cities for Ukraine would be seen by many who have fought in this war and by the public at large as capitulation, as treason. And I think even if Zelensky were willing to make a deal where he would give up these cities and this land, which currently Ukraine controls, of course, I think there would be broad, wide-scale discontent within Ukrainian society, potentially even a mutiny by some of the units within the Ukrainian armed forces. I don't think this would be popular. I don't think he intends to go there. I think it's just simply not feasible for him politically, but it is what Putin is demanding. And again, there is no overlapping Venn diagram between what Putin wants and what Zelensky is able to give.
Now, some take a leaf out of Finland's book, this idea of Finlandization, which was a country largely hamstrung, of course, by a post-Soviet agreement after World War II. Is there a case that Ukraine could be forced to cede land, accept a Kremlin-friendly form of neutrality, but still maintain its independence and ultimately flourish?
Theoretically, yes. But again, Ukraine would need to have some sort of guarantee, either bilateral from the United States or multilateral through NATO, that would be backed up not just by a piece of paper or by a legally binding agreement, but by some sort of practical steps that would signify a true commitment on the part of Western powers to supporting its sovereignty. Absent that, and remember, I mean, Ukraine is a country that suffered through the Budapest Memorandum, which it thought was a credible security guarantee backed by the UK and the United States. But in fact, when Russia violated the terms of that agreement, neither the UK nor the United States came to the defense of Ukraine as they would of a NATO ally, where Article 5 was invoked. And so I think absent something credible that guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty, and Finlandization is not that. Neutrality, as Finland experienced in the decades after World War II, is not going to secure Ukraine's future. And so I don't think they're going to go for any sort of solution that has a similar structure to it.
You were Joe Biden's security advisor when he was in office. Are we closer to peace now than we were under President Joe Biden?
No, we're not. I truly believe the solution lies in empowering Ukraine to defend itself and finally imposing serious sanctions on the Russian war machine. And, I regret that more was not done during the Biden administration in which I served. Certainly sanctions were imposed both by the EU and by the United States, but not nearly enough to cripple the war machine such that Putin might have to consider seriously whether to abandon the fighting on the battlefield. He's weathered well over 1 million casualties in terms of dead and wounded. That has not deterred him. His economy actually grew in both 2023 and 2024. So the economic sanctions clearly have not had the impact that a lot of Western leaders claim they've had. So I truly believe that more pressure needs to be put on Russia economically. Ukraine needs to be given the means to defend itself. And then potentially we could see a situation where Mr. Putin might be willing to make a deal and cut his losses. But we're not there yet.
We're running out of time, but I want to end with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who says Russia is trying to weaken European security with these Ukraine negotiations. He's insisting that these talks matter, of course, beyond just Kyiv. Is Europe, in your mind, especially the eastern flank, I'm talking about the likes of Poland here too, facing one of its most dangerous moments in recent history?
Yes. Put quite simply, yes. This is a moment of peril for the future of European security because it could very well be decided without key players at the table. And countries like Poland need to be able to have a voice. There should not be discussions of European security without Poland at the table and without, frankly, all of those eastern flank states' voices represented. Because the United States has been saying that it has an America First policy. Europe should defend itself. Europe should develop the capabilities so that it can deter future Russian aggression. Well, that's all well and fine. But if Europe is facing a choice of whether to protect its own future, then it needs to have a say in how this agreement to end the war turns out, because ultimately that will dictate the European security architecture that Europe is dealing with for the next few decades.
Mr. Michael Carpenter, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on TVP World.
My pleasure.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Dahmen. Good night.